Classic Universal monsters are the very first cinematic universe, long before such a thing was ever called a cinematic universe. It seemed only fair that after Marvel found financial success with the concept, that Universal would want to revive its own version of the strategy with its classic monsters. Of course, we all know how that turned out. But I'm a little sore about it because 1, it's a great idea, 2, it's something Universal is in a unique position to do, and 3, nobody else is doing it. What I want to do here is pitch my idea for how they could still go about doing such a thing now. And I'm using pitch in a kind of loose sense because this is more of a thought experiment / fan fiction kind of thing. But this is essentially my proposal for how you could make a, as they were trying to call it, dark universe work. Now, I'm not the first person to do this. To my knowledge, there have been 2 other videos on exactly the subject. In the first, released after the failure of the 2017 Mummy but before the success of the 2020 Invisible Man, proposed a series of low-budget horror films with interesting takes on the creatures headlined by rising stars in the horror genre, not actors, but directors. This included A Creature from the Black Lagoon by the director of Stranger Things, where the creature is a government experiment, a Frankenstein origin story told from the perspective of the villagers, a werewolf movie made by Jordan Peele, and Dracula and Van Helsing movies written by Warren Ellis. All interesting ideas, sound great, love to see it. The second was in an episode of the series called Reboot It, which came after the 2020 Invisible Man movie. The conclusion reached there was to make a story follow women who had survived encounters with the monster eventually coming together because no one else believes them. This is an interesting idea, but if you'll notice, it's pretty much the idea of the Invisible Man, just with every monster getting their own version of the main character from that 2020 Invisible Man movie. What's more, they decided that there was no such thing as a supernatural, and Dracula, instead of actually being, Dracula, was a Nazi super science experiment from the 1940s. So, that one didn't do as well. So, what am I bringing to the table to justify a third take? Well, it's quite simple, really. I don't want to reinvent the wheel and make the Universal Monsters something that they're not. This pitch for a Universal Monsters Cinematic Universe, or UMCU for short, is going to be exactly that. A Universal Monsters Cinematic Universe. It's going to stay on brand. The truth is, these characters are not under copyright. The most recent of them is from the 1930s, and we'll get into that later, but the oldest can be said to be from medieval folklore or even ancient Rome, depending on your perspective. Literally anyone can make any movie or story about these monsters they want at any time. They can even make their own cinematic universe with them, and it won't make a difference. The most recent examples of this are the Underworld movies, which hinged on a war between vampires and werewolves, did a version of Frankenstein, but then never crossed him over. Sure, the Twilight movies kind of did the same thing on paper, but let's be honest, the only real vampire in those movies was Peter Murphy. So, of course, no one else is doing it, but there are other Dracula, Frankenstein, and werewolf movies out there that these ideas would be competing with, and the marketing is going to be banking on the fact that these are specifically the universal versions of these characters, and I'm going to lean on that. What I'm not going to do is get bogged down in things like the cast and crew. This is primarily because I don't know anything about the kind of people working in Hollywood these days. I would love to see Peter Murphy as Dracula. I think that's a match made in hell. I know I'm not really interested in having Warren Ellis write for the series because as great as the Castlevania cartoon is, that's not what my UMCU proposal is about, and I don't know that he's done anything like this before. Because I have no idea who anyone working in Hollywood is or what they've done, because I don't really give a shit about Hollywood movies and never really have. It's all important, I just don't know enough to have opinions on what the right choices should be. What I will say about it is this. 1, get a European horror icon to play the original Frankenstein monster. 2, you need a strong leading man for Larry Talbot, but stay the hell away from like a big teen heartthrob kind of guy, because the character is all about misery and despair. Get an actual fucking Egyptian to play the mummy. And Dracula is the single most important casting decision of the entire thing because you have to get that right. The original Universal Dracula is still, to this day, the definitive Dracula. There will never be anyone who can overtake Bela Lugosi. Even Christopher Lee, who is, I'll remind you, fucking Christopher Lee, is a distant second. An English accent will work for a Dracula 200 or more years from his roots, but if you can't get the lead singer of Bauhaus, you at least need to get the accent right. And whoever you get has to be, one, damn good at being Dracula, or two, someone on the caliber of Peter Murphy that the goth kids will inherently understand has every right to play the guy. Is Udo Kier still alive? He'd be fucking awesome. It doesn't really matter how old the guy is, or young, also. All that matters is if they can nail it. Outside of that, hire actors with experience in the theater, hire directors whose favorite band is the Sisters. I don't know, whatever. I don't know names, I just know that you can't force a square peg into a round hole. Which kind of leads into the next thing that we need to get out of the way. Why didn't the previous attempts work? Well, Dracula Untold did something with Dracula we'd never seen in a film before at that point, which was the true extent of his raw power. And that was really incredible. Unfortunately, everything else about the movie was trash. It told the story of Dracula as an English family man just trying to do what's right who gets bitten by a vampire. Literally none of that. For your benefit, I'll organize the most horrible problems with this into a numbered list. 1. This was a historical drama about Dracula before he became a monster, which means it's about Dracula, the real, actual person that really, actually existed. Dracula was not English. He did not have an English accent. He was Romanian, spoke Romanian, and had a Romanian accent. 2. Dracula was an absolutely bloodthirsty madman that waged a religious war of psychological terror against his own brother. He once had a Turk's hat nailed to his fucking head. He was not kind, well-meaning, patient, wise, or a loving family man. He was, even in life, a fucking monster. 3. There is no version of the Dracula story, that is, the story of Dracula as a monster, that includes him being bitten by another vampire. The assumption that this happened comes from two other assumptions. That of the way vampire lore works, and that Dracula was even a vampire to begin with. The few times we do see Dracula become a monster, it's always a unique method and ultimately involves him being cursed by an altogether more malevolent force like death in Castlevania. And 4, also, having Dracula being bitten means he's not special anymore, that he's just a vampire, and that there is an older and more powerful one than him somewhere out there, and possibly a large number of them. This undercuts the fact that Dracula is Dracula, and so makes the character a shadow of himself. The problem with The Mummy is, of course, that they tried to put all of their eggs in one basket too soon and force something down people's throats that no one was asking for. They hired big-name, famous Hollywood stars to establish an existing universe before they even had a single story out of the gate. They started from the conclusion and then worked backwards, and it felt fake and forced because, well, it was. However, you can't really blame them for this because the current climate of Hollywood kind of forced them into that situation. Just like it forced DC's hand to make Batman v Superman before they even made a proper Batman movie in that universe, and then compounded the problems by skipping all the way ahead to the Justice League way before it was earned. It's the same problem, and it's there for the same reason. They saw Marvel's setup with a big communal writer's room establishing overarching stories over multiple films and basically treating the franchise like episodes of a TV show, and established that they had to do the same thing. So they tried to establish a universe, tell their audience that they had one, and that every story in it was just another episode, and as a result, the fact that it was supposed to be a mummy movie got lost somewhere in the mix. The original classic Universal monster films didn't work this way. They made a movie, and when it was successful, they made a sequel. As multiple series in the same genre succeeded, they started to cross over, and as a result, they all grew together. Godzilla is my bread and butter, and the Showa Toho films worked in exactly the same way, just on a bigger scale. Meanwhile, I have no interest in these Marvel superhero movies at all. I kind of like Western superheroes. I mean, I love Superman, but all of the Western superheroes that I know are DC, and all I know about Spider-Man is that he drives a giant robot. And if Leopardon's not in it, then I don't care. So to me, when I think cinematic universe, I think of a core series like Frankenstein or Godzilla, gradually pulling in elements from other films being produced by the same studio in the same genre at the same time, with overlapping staff that grow into a core series naturally over time. So we're not going to do the one movie per monster and then forcing a Van Helsing at the end, because that doesn't interest me and it doesn't feel like Universal monsters to me. Instead, what we're going to do is make one movie and then the next, and then, eventually start cross-pollinating them. Before we continue, we need to talk about the H word. That's right, horror. What is horror? What is a horror movie? Few things in this world have less meaning to me than horror movie. The classic Universal monster films have been, and usually still are, called horror movies. But what does that mean? It'd be easy to say that the horror genre is one where the intent is to scare the audience, but is that what the 1931 Dracula is really trying to do? And even if it was in its own time, does it scare you? When you think of movies that have actually scared you, where does Bride of Frankenstein fit into that list? What part of House of Dracula kept you up at night and gave you nightmares when you did finally fall asleep? And yeah, I'm going to go there. How many times did you hear your grandma, or even great-grandma at this point, tell you stories of how she was lying awake at night in a cold sweat, freaking out at every creaky floorboard for months after she saw the chilling terror of Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy? So you might think, well, these films don't scare us today, but they definitely scared audiences of the time, so our goal should be to make these monsters frightening again. But for one, I just don't play and believe that. I've never heard anyone, whether they were around at the time or not, actually talk about any of these movies as if they're actually scary. But more importantly, when you say that films were once successful horror films but are no longer, you're basically calling them failures that need to be fixed. But that's not true. The classic Universal monsters are still beloved, classics that are put up on pedestals to this day as genre-defining landmarks. People fucking love these old movies, and it has nothing to do with them being scary. They aren't classic Universal scary movies, they're monster movies. That's the genre. Maybe I gave it away too much by bringing up Godzilla, but sincerely, when was the last time you saw any movie about any of these monsters that truly scared you? I've been thinking about this for days, and honestly, all I've got is that nightmare scene from American Werewolf in London. And that was pretty fucked up, but it didn't actually involve the werewolves at all. It was, just a weird nightmare. The fact that the 2017 Mummy was an action movie had literally nothing to do with its failure. All of that was the forced cinematic universe stuff that threw it out of whack. And we know that that's true, because the previous time that Universal redid its Mummy movies were also action movies, and they were incredibly successful. So no, we're not going to try to make these monsters actually scary, because that's not the brand. That's not what a Universal monster movie is. So, what is it about these movies that works? Why do people keep coming back to them 90 years later? Well, think about it. When you think about the 1931 Dracula and Frankenstein movies, what comes to mind? That's right. Bela Lugosi's performance as Dracula, Boris Karloff's performance as the Frankenstein monster, the Frankenstein makeup, the bittersweet scene of him throwing that little girl into the lake, Dwight Frye's scene stealing Renfield, the moody and atmospheric set of the graveyard, of the crumbling castles, Colin Clive's doctor screaming in mad joy as he creates life. These are the things that make these movies great. The atmosphere, the sets, and the performances. The original films are a lot like watching a more elaborate stage play. You can hook anyone on any old werewolf movie, but as I've said before, You're not making any old werewolf movie here. We're making a universal werewolf movie. The tone, the setting, the mood, this is what people love about the Universal monsters. And if you're going to bring them back, you want the audience who loves the originals to see this new series as a return to what made them so great in the first place. And I have a little bit of a problem with the T word too, which is timeless. I don't really believe that anything is actually timeless. Even the monomyth only works in a time where humans both exist and are telling myths, so nothing is really timeless. What people really mean when they call the original films timeless is that the characters are still culturally recognizable without involving a level of technology that specifically dates them. It's actually extremely ambiguous whether the original films are period pieces or not. It's only really in the films of the 40s that it's clear that they're taking place in contemporary times, but even then the Mummy movies are all over the place, going way out into the future without even trying to seem like it. The thing is, if we tried to do that today, we just have to explain why the characters don't have access to cell phones, and if we did do that, then we would know that we are in a time where cell phones exist. The gulf between today and any time before the end of the World Wars is far too great now to reasonably try to keep that same ambiguity. And you really can't keep the same tone by doing Dracula with cell phones and access to the internet. But it's definitely a movie, but it's not a universal monster movie. So paradoxically, although it kind of proves my point, in order to make things feel timeless, as the old films do, we have to nail down these movies firmly in their own time. The thing all these monsters have in common is that they're all undead. The world around them grows and changes, but they linger through the centuries or even millennia as cursed creatures of the night. So not only will these movies be period dramas, we will be following them throughout the ages. The mortal characters won't last the centuries, but their families will, which gives us the themes of family and legacy to play with. The monsters, meanwhile, are tragic figures. Even Dracula is a victim of circumstance to a certain degree, but especially werewolves and the cognizant Frankenstein monsters are as much victims as they are aggressors. To tie these two themes together, these curses don't just follow the monsters, but the families they affect, bringing tragedy down on them generation after generation. And this is where the strength of the UMCU will be, because it's not a gimmick, it's not a Me Too concept to grab at what Marvel has already earned. The UMCU will have history. The history of one monster or family won't always affect the others, but as we fill out this timeline, the world we create becomes richer, because we're not creating a linear sequence of conflicts, but a whole alternate universe historical fiction dripping with blood. We are essentially combining the best parts of the Universal and Hammer series to make our very own version of Castlevania. It may not be horror per se, but it is gothic, it is monsters, and it is universal. One last thing before we get into the films themselves: what exactly make up the Universal monsters? This is actually an open-ended question. As far as the original series is concerned, only Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman ever actually crossed over together. In 2004's Van Helsing, they gave some screen time to Mr. Hyde, and he also showed up in the latest Mummy. But Universal never made a Mr. Hyde movie during the classic period, so we're going to completely ignore him. The Mummy and the Invisible Man showed up in the Abbott and Costello movies, with the Invisible Man actually making a cameo at the very end of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And the Mummy has appeared in several non-Universal monster mashes over the years, and is one of the studio's most enduring monsters with this branding, especially after the success of the Brendan Fraser movies. The creature from the Black Lagoon is kind of iconic in the branding, but has absolutely no connection to the other monsters outside of an appearance in the Monster Squad, which wasn't a Universal movie. The last one that can really be considered a part of the core group without getting too obnoxious would be the Phantom of the Opera. We could go on to start including the Metaluna Mutant or the Monolith monsters, but at that point we're clutching at straws. The only other monster I'd really want to include that Universal has a claim to is King Kong, so we can finally do King Kong versus Frankenstein. However, that's branching out in a different style of monster movie and will be a sort of special case. Of those, we have to cut out the Phantom and the Invisible Man right from the get-go. First of all, they're literally not monsters. They're ordinary humans. The Invisible Man has the ability to make themselves invisible, but that's not an inherent trait or a supernatural curse, nor is being burned really badly. Of course, the Invisible Man has their own thing going at Universal right now, and this idea for UMCU is independent of that. It could be interesting to entertain the idea of a crossover in the future, but that's a degree of fan fiction which I feel is beyond the scope of this exercise, because it's not something I really want to see or have any interest in. I'm here for the monsters. A guy who can turn invisible isn't a monster, and does not belong in this series of monster movies. The last one that doesn't really fit in is the creature from the Black Lagoon, or the Gill Man, as people like to call him. He isn't technically based on any existing Eastern European folklore or classic Gothic horror novel. He's not wholly an original creation either, but it doesn't really seem like anyone involved in the making of those films was aware of the fact that they were making a less compelling version of a monster that already existed. So, in a way, it's kind of its own thing. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then don't worry, because I'm going to include the Gill Man, but it won't be as part of the first phase, as it were, and it's not really going to have anything to do with the films from the 50s. Remember, the core connecting fibers of the series is that the monsters are undead, that they're cursed, and the stories branch out over centuries to show the effects on generations of people. In its original form, the universal Gill Man does not fit into this scheme, so while I do have an idea of what to do with it, we'll save it for later. Additionally, as the Mummy is both the only one to never cross over in the original series and only non-European monster, we're not actually going to tie it in directly with the core three of Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Werewolves, or the Transylvanian Trio, as I like to call them. It will still fit into this larger world and will still cover it, but at least in the first phase, the Mummy will be its own thing.
I am Dracula.
First of all, let's talk about Dracula. The big question is, do we do an origin story? And there's two ways to interpret this. For Dracula, people have seen adaptations of the 1897 novel plenty of times already, and while the story of Dracula's origin has been done considerably less, it's still been done, including Universal's last Dracula movie. I don't really think you need to start with either of those stories. It would be expected, sure, but it's both a little boring, and also we can always come back to them later if we want to. Personally, I find the story of Dracula when he was alive to be a fascinating story of real-life war crimes. But the thing is, every Dracula movie has the chance to be just that, so there's really no point in limiting ourselves. Instead, we're starting at least 200 years after Dracula became a monster, when he's already shrouded in legends, already at the peak of his powers, with plenty of time to grow his influence and infamy. When the characters discover Dracula's true identity, they'll know exactly who they're really dealing with. So this part is going to be considered, depending on your perspective, as a choice or a change, maybe. But it is a major sticking point for me. Dracula is not a vampire. He was never bitten by a vampire. His powers came from a completely distinct and wholly supernatural source. He can mimic the abilities of a vampire, and of werewolves as well, but he can also take many other forms, such as a swarm of rats, or insects, or a thick mist. And his ultimate form, and at this point true form, is that of a large dragon, something that can raise entire cities. There are certainly vampires in the UMCU, but they are not related to Dracula. Those Dracula bites don't gain the curse of becoming a monster in and of themselves, but rather become a sort of slave to his power, and when they have Dracula's blood in them, they essentially are Dracula, just a mere extension of his will, something more like an avatar than their own distinct monster in their own right. Dracula is a warlord, a general that uses psychological terror as a weapon. He has subordinates in the form of other undead, not just vampires, but werewolves, and in the appropriate time period, maybe even some Frankenstein monsters, and any other creatures we want to cook up as well. Dracula is above all a manipulator. He uses his control over people, deception, and his endless lifespan to concoct plans that lead the whole world into ruin. Dracula became a monster when, after fighting a religious war, he was betrayed by his own god. He is a deeply religious figure who fully accepts that the religion he held in life is the reality of the world, and he sees it as his mission to punish God by torturing his creation. We won't be seeing him leading an army of monsters across the world, devastating everything in sight, at least not at first. Dracula has all the time he needs. He doesn't need to rush into anything. And most of all, he has a powerful faith in the inherent evil of mankind, so he won't bother getting his hands dirty if he doesn't need to. If action needs to be taken, he'll send an underling, or even one of his enthralled avatars to deal with it. That's what they're there for. When Dracula does take action, it's nothing like the rubber bat on a string or snarling Englishmen of the original Universal or Hammer movies. The setting and the tone is classic, but this Dracula is fully modern. His power is unspeakable and potentially without limit. Maybe he can't literally kill with a thought, but when he's on screen and the audience knows his identity, they should absolutely feel like he could at any moment. Dracula is without a doubt the core of the series. In this plan, we'll get a trilogy of Dracula films in different time periods before crossing over with the original Frankenstein monster and Larry Talbot in the final 2 films of the first cycle. We can do a version of the original 1897 novel as part of the trilogy if we want, but we're not starting that way. 2 things we're taking from the Dracula mythos are his ability to be essentially anywhere, including multiple places at the same time, by making the soul clone theory of the Walt Disney universe explicit with the effect of his blood, which can let us have multiple people play the same character, which is why I said it's perfectly fine to find him with an English accent 200 years on. But even defeating a piece of him is never really a victory. He is an indomitable force in this way. Additionally, we're taking from the Castlevania series the idea that he reappears every 100 years or so, although not with any exactitude. Every century has at least one Dracula story to tell, and each of the first 3 Dracula movies should be set at the very least 50 years apart. The 3 eras I most want to see Dracula in are the Baroque period, the Napoleonic Wars, and the Great War. I think it would be fun to start with something in the Baroque period as a nod to Castlevania, but there's less about this time that would resonate as something truly terrible we can make Dracula responsible for. And in each of these cases, that is the story. Dracula concocts a plan to plunge the world into chaos and death by manipulation and sheer power, and the result is something we already know from history. Although the original novel didn't really connect to the real Dracula in any meaningful way, like it or not, Dracula was a real person, and to tell a story about that person, who already was a monster in life, doing monstrous things with supernatural powers, I think the narrative to follow is readily apparent. Another thing important about the first of these Dracula movies is that Dracula should win. People discover his plot and attempt to stop him, but fail, and ultimately the damage is done while Dracula slinks back into the night, returning as the wheel of time turns to unleash the evil of men once more. This strengthens the argument to start during the Baroque period because the story taking place during the Napoleonic or Great Wars will be happening after the war has already started, and in that scenario, we're free to foil Dracula because at that point the damage is already done. He's already sown his chaos, and it's out of his hands what mortals do. As far as characters go, we need to introduce, possibly in the earliest of this trilogy chronologically, the first Van Helsing to encounter Dracula, and establish a feud that will mirror that of the Belmonts. We also need to establish a werewolf character during the Napoleonic Wars, a character who discovers that Dracula is behind whatever foul scheme he's up to, and gets attacked by one of Dracula's minions and then cursed. And this character doesn't get a happy ending. He is from that point on one of Dracula's children of the night. In the latest of these 3 chronologically, we should show that Dracula is now using Frankenstein monsters. As a way of introducing them, it'll be from the characters discovering the monster on the battlefield, killing it, and then getting sucked down the rabbit hole of its origins, which leads them to ultimately discovering Dracula. This won't be the Frankenstein monster, and it may not even be created by a doctor who's actually a Frankenstein. But those are the details to work out in the chronology of the Frankenstein movies. As for the last 2 films, we'll come to them when we get there, but first, Frankenstein.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
For Frankenstein, again, we really don't need to hear the same old story. Certainly there is a version of it that happens in the MCU, but just as there is a version of Dracula's origin and his exploits in 1897, but we don't really need to see them, at least not at first. Instead, for the 2 solo Frankenstein films, I want to focus on what the driving force is behind the people creating or reviving the monsters, and then build outwards. For me, the most compelling uses of Frankenstein are when it's a story about grief, and when it's a story about the search for understanding. So those are the 2 stories we'll be tackling, with grief first, as that's going to be the most emotionally gripping of the 2 when you want to start off strong. Before we keep going, though, there's an elephant in this room that I need to address about names. The monsters created by Dr. Frankenstein, any Frankenstein, are also Frankensteins. The original story is one about creating life, and the monster is thematically the Doctor's child and is, therefore, a Frankenstein. The Doctor doesn't actually have to be a Frankenstein in every case, but any monster created in such a fashion as invented by the original Doctor is a Frankenstein. We're going to be making this very explicit in these films because I am fucking sick of hearing pedantic little bitches whine about this. The monsters are Frankensteins. Deal with it. Some of the monsters will get first names, some of them won't, and it won't matter either way. Also, while the Universal series followed a single monster and multiple doctors, and then the Hammer series went with one doctor creating multiple monsters, because we're going to be hopping around different periods of times, we can't really follow the same doctor the whole time, but we're not always going to be sticking with the same monster either. Case in point, our first story about grief won't have anything to do with the original monster. Our first Frankenstein film will be about the illegitimate son of Victor Frankenstein discovering his true parentage and, of course, refusing the call. He'll come by this revelation by someone handling the Frankenstein estate and being given the notes of the journals of his father, whom his grandparents couldn't bring themselves to destroy, and so will find themselves in the hand of Victor Frankenstein's son, who we can call Victor Seville if we really want to, but we don't have to. The son will find themselves in a similar situation where he's appalled by the nature of his father's research, but can't really bring himself to destroy it either. Things will take a turn, however, when their child dies in some terrible accident. In fact, make it a little girl that died by drowning just to make it a mythology nod, and then, driven mad by grief, they turn to the notes of Frankenstein to bring them back. But this Frankenstein isn't a doctor, and the monster he creates will be nothing like the intelligent, thoughtful creature we know from so many other iterations, but something truly unholy. This fixes my major problem with the story of Frankenstein, which is that it's treated as a horror story just because it's interpreted as a sin. But you're never going to convince me to root against someone who's trying to cure death. That's not going to happen. The Doctor in these movies is the protagonist, and we should be rooting for them to succeed. We want them to achieve their intellectual and emotional goals. The conflict shouldn't be based on something dependent on the audience's personal beliefs. Instead, the monster will be a mistake because it is sincerely a monster, a malformed, wild killing thing wearing the face of its creator's daughter. While this young Frankenstein monster shouldn't survive the film, its very nature as an undead monster should give it the ability to reappear later down the line if we need it to. Now, this story is important to tell because people already know the story of the original Frankenstein, and they know that he never had a child. So by starting off there, we can establish the Frankenstein family as a family. But didn't I just kill off Victor Seville's only child, I hear you asking? Sure I did. But we don't have to kill off the wife, and even if we do, we're not killing off Frankenstein's son. So we don't actually have to make it explicit how the family line continues from here. We just have to leave the door open better than the original novel did, which showed Frankenstein's wife dying before they could have a child, and then Frankenstein himself dying from exposure afterwards. Hell, we don't even need to have Victor's journals survive the film, because the core concept of the second Frankenstein film is about someone later down the line trying to rediscover them independently. This will occur sometime in the late 19th century, with a character roughly analogous to Colin Clive's Henry Frankenstein or the Doctor of the Hammer films. They're not going to be a straight-up villain like Peter Cushing, and they're also not going to be the naive, hopeful type like Henry, but somewhere in between. This is likely the Frankenstein from the last movie's grandchild, and it doesn't matter what gender they are, although following a Son of Frankenstein film with a Daughter of Frankenstein sequel would be pretty dope. Either way, when we meet this Frankenstein, we are knee-deep in trying to rediscover the secrets of their great-grandfather, a legacy that has been told to them as a boogeyman in a cautionary tale, but that they've always seen as a matter of pride and something that, like me and like our audience hopefully, is more about conquering death and creating abominations. We meet them in the midst of failure. Whatever the secret was to their great-grandfather's success, it has eluded them, and although they've made progress, they feel like they're circling the drain. Lamenting their inability to ask their great-grandfather directly, they have an epiphany. What if they could ask his creation? The thing was said to be immortal, right? So this film is the first time we meet the original Frankenstein monster, and full stop. This should be a show-stopping return to form. Universal doesn't own Frankenstein, but they do own the design that is universally associated with the monster, and this is their chance to use it completely unironically. Certainly update the thing, give it a fresh coat of paint and the like, but this is the movie where you really get to lean in on the classic iconography of the original films, and you'd be a fool not to do that. So the monster is successfully revived, only for the Doctor to discover that he has no interest in helping, and in fact bemoans the fact that he was revived at all. This Frankenstein monster is right where we saw him at the end of the original Bride of Frankenstein, or Larry Talbot at the beginning of Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. He doesn't want to be here, and he'll do anything to end his miserable, unnatural life. It's going to be up to the Doctor, who, in this generation, is an actual doctor with a solid understanding of medicine for the time, to try and reason with the monster. The original Frankenstein recoiled in horror at what he created, but this Frankenstein grew up their whole life seeing the creation of life and cure for death as something to aspire to achieve. They see the monster as something truly worthy of celebration, and not only have to convince them to value their life, but the mere fact that they exist at all. This is, more than anything, the Frankenstein movie I really want. This is a conversation between these characters that we really need to have, and these are the themes at the core of the original story, presented in a way that makes them relevant in a way the original never did. Wherever the Doctor and the monster settle on the issues, the end of the film will have them reaching some sort of agreement. The Doctor will continue with their research, and the monster will try to move on with their life. As for the monster action, the monster will certainly have acted out in a way to provoke others into seeing it as a threat to be stopped, in order to get others to kill it. So we leave off with lasting legends of a terrible monster, a course-corrected family lineage that now has both access to and respect for the secrets of undeath, and the monster itself sulking off into the shadows to live their own life with a new perspective. Basically, we've established in 2 movies everything we need to do in order to drop any Frankenstein lore throughout any of the other movies at any time.
Years ago, I was bitten by a werewolf. Ever since, when the full moon rises, I turn into a wolf myself.
Oh, pal. That's all right. I'm sort of a wolf myself.
Werewolves are among my favorite non-Toho monsters, because they are such a powerful way to portray individuals turning into monsters. This works as a metaphor for really any interpersonal conflict you want to. Addiction, mental health, it even works as a puberty metaphor. Granted, since this is a Universal Monster series, we have to make Larry Talbot a central character and follow him throughout multiple movies. But there's no reason why we have to make him the only werewolf in the series. I've already mentioned a werewolf in the Napoleonic War Dracula movie, and there can very well be others. While Larry Talbot will be, for all intents and purposes, the Wolfman, and we will follow him through 3 films, we are going to make a detour to do one other solo werewolf movie about someone else. I think it would probably be smartest to start with the Wolfman, but the other solo werewolf film is important because it's going to be about the werewolf that bit Larry. So let's talk about how werewolves, and by extension vampires, will work in these films. There are basically 3 forms of werewolf: your furry but otherwise human wolfman, your half-man, half-wolf hybrid monster like in the Howling or Dog Soldiers, and the fully quadruped monstrous wolf forms a la American Werewolf in London and Ginger Snaps. In order to make stories that follow a single werewolf really work, we have to adopt rules similar to the original Larry Talbot or Waldemar Daninsky films. But we also need to establish that there are both enough of them that you can conceivably be bitten by one out on the moors, but they're also rare enough that this happens so infrequently that most people just assume they're legends. The solution to this is to have them in smaller numbers, be larger threats, have reliable methods to put them down, but also make them relatively easy to bring back. And the way we're going to do this is to make the extent of their transformation change over time. A freshly bitten werewolf will only turn into a wolfman during the full moon, but the longer they are alive, the more wolf-like they become, eventually becoming a Krynos-type werewolf, and being able to transform either at will for those who embrace being a monster, or at really any point the story needs them to for those who don't. the final state of the oldest werewolves is to becoming fully wolf-like beast permanently. Young werewolves can be killed off by non-silver and regenerate slower, but will inevitably do so after any objects such as swords or bullets are removed, while it will definitely take silver to take down the older ones. But again, removing it will bring them back. The rules will work largely the same with vampires, with the younger ones appearing like essentially pale humans with fangs, unable to take bat form at all, and then the older vampires becoming progressively more monstrous and Nosferatu-like, with their bat forms being appropriately large and hideous. The non-Larry Talbot movie will be an adaptation of the classic novel Werewolf of Paris, but with our werewolf rules affixed over his origins, and then with the rest of the story playing out as normal. We can have Bertrand bitten during the war by the werewolf from the Napoleonic Dracula movie, who at this point would have been a werewolf for something like 60 years. Bertrand himself will either not actually be killed or will be resurrected at some point, and then he will be the werewolf that bites Larry Talbot. As for the Larry Talbot movie, the original was ambiguous but seems to be roughly contemporary. The 2010 film, however, set it in 1891. Because our Monster Mash films will be happening around World War II, we need a little time for Larry to progress to the later hybrid stage of his curse, so it'll be closer to the remakes era. We're not making his father a werewolf too because that was the 2010 movie's gimmick and we need to do our own thing. We could do a play on that by actually having Larry bite his father and then John taking his own life at the end. Considering the impetus for Larry's return is the death of his brother, we could also have his brother be a werewolf and then actually interact with Larry. But whatever we do, it shouldn't just be the exact same story as either of the previous versions. They were both fantastic in their own way, and I'm not interested in remakes, so there needs to be something about this version of the story to make it unique. In the end, however, either Larry's father or love interest kills them, and not with a cane, but with a silver bullet, because we need to have the bullet removed by grave robbers in order to bring him back. And you can't really remove a cane, and the cane is iconic and everything, but that's already been done, and we're trying to make a new version of the story here. Before we get to the climax of the series, we gotta talk about The Mummy. The main revelation of our Mummy film is going to be its connections to the other monsters. We're basically going to pull a page from Underworld here and make the vampires and werewolves mutations from an ancestral immortal bloodline, something like Highlanders. We don't need to figure out the specifics of why they mutated or when they mutated, not in the Mummy movie at least, and not even really here at all, but we're going to make our Mummy the patient zero of the whole thing. And it's going to be Imhotep again, and it's going to directly parallel Dracula. Both Imhotep and Dracula have independently achieved undeath or immortality via some supernatural force, and whilst Dracula's blood is a corruptive and destructive force, the descendants of Imhotep are free to live fulfilling lives in full view of the sun. Both have an array of magical abilities that are unique to them, with Imhotep being able to take multiple forms and, of course, have some cool sand powers. We can also have other mummies too, like Karis if we really want. But these other immortals don't share Imhotep's shape-changing powers. Maybe they can keep the sand tsunami things or some other cool powers, but we don't want to associate the bloodline of the original immortals with any specific animal other than humans. This can actually leave a door open for other kinds of undead creatures. Maybe even show that the oddly headed depictions of Egyptian gods are based on different bloodlines of immortals that become snakes or hawks or whatever else. And the wolf and bat versions are just the very most recent medieval branches of the tree. To drive this parallel with Dracula home, the Imhotep movie is going to be more or less the Dracula story we already know, but with Egyptian set dressing. That is the story of an immortal man living so long that they come to meet the reincarnation of a lost lover. We also need to establish that the reason Imhotep was mummified in the first place was because of mortals being afraid of his power and thinking he was some sort of, monster. And realizing that they couldn't kill him outright, instead sealed him away in a state of undeath for millennia. Imhotep is also a real person who really existed at one point long ago, but he wasn't an infamous figure. We won't focus too much on the historical fiction for his origin story, but I definitely want our Imhotep to be the real Imhotep, and put his origin story in the correct time period. It is significantly harder to nail down the facts of the real person's life as we're dealing with far older records, but if we're going to make Dracula Dracula, we should at least have Imhotep be Imhotep. The fate of Imhotep and his reincarnated love can be anything, really. At some point, a confrontation between Imhotep and Dracula really needs to happen, and they're both immortal, so that's not an issue to bring them both back whenever we need. However, we always have Karis to come back if we really need to tell another mummy story, so we don't have to worry about leaving things a certain way for the sake of sequels. The one thing I do want to stick with is that, with Dracula, we established that there are 400 years between Vlad's first wife and Mina Harker, so there should be a 400-year cycle between reincarnations, i.e. having the same actor play a character. This means that the story should be set in the 19th century and feature the 11th reincarnation of Imhotep's lover, since their original lives together. Unlike Dracula, who I would love to kill off in a 1999 Castlevania war-type movie, I think it's reasonable to assume that Imhotep will survive into the 23rd century to see the next reincarnation. So we can have whatever ending we want for the two characters in this time, as they'll have another chance to be together the next time around. And what's interesting about the cycle is that it actually matches up with Dracula's, so we could do an interesting crossover, with the reincarnation of Imhotep's lover and Mina Harker if we really wanted to. Before we continue, I want to talk a little bit about the mythology and the spirituality of the series. We should allow the audience to assume, in the Dracula movies, that Dracula's religion is essentially correct, and that the supernatural forces behind his curse are what he believes they are. Likewise, in the Mummy movies, we should let the audience assume that his religion is essentially correct, and that the supernatural forces behind his curse are what he believes that they are. We do not need to say for certain if one is truth and the other isn't. We don't need to say if both Yahweh and Anubis exist in this world, and we don't need to say if neither of them do. It has never mattered how much of Mothra's divinity was genuine, only that we understood that some part of Mothra's nature was in some way mystical. In the same way, all that really matters in the story of Dracula and Imhotep is that they believe what they believe, and for what we see of the supernatural in their stories, we should understand why they believe it. The truth is beyond the scope of, at the very least, this initial run of films. It doesn't matter. The only objective facts that the series is going to establish about this universe is that both of these monsters gained their powers from some external force that we don't fully understand at any point in the time when the films take place. Meanwhile, the Frankenstein doctors fully understand the source of their monster's undeath. There is very much a reason and a method to Dracula and Imhotep's undeath in exactly the same way that there is to Frankenstein's, and all three of them are different reasons and methods, but they are all firmly rooted in the reality of the universe we're creating. It is, in effect, a natural law of the universe of these stories that these forces exist, but the characters will always treat these things with the idea that they are supernatural, and regard them in whatever way their almost always religious understanding of the world can best rationalize them to be. How the characters regard the events is more important in the movies than whatever is actually causing them. Of course, having said that, there is an explanation for them, but I'll get to that in a minute. The first major crossover between the main monster characters, I think, really has to be Frankenstein versus the Wolfman. We can call it Frankenstein X the Wolfman or Frankenstein V the Wolfman if we want, but I think it's probably best to just stick with versus. Just as long as it isn't meats. I want to differentiate the title from the original. Like the original, we'll follow Larry Talbot as he's revived in the middle of World War II, but unlike the original, we're actually going to acknowledge the fact that it's the middle of World War II. He'll go to see Dr. Frankenstein to seek a cure, but the current doctor won't be easy to track down, because they'll be on the run from the Nazis, who want to use them to create monsters. For their part, the doctor is working with the resistance, so we're probably set in France, in order to be, a doctor. Meanwhile, we'll have the Nazis do something similar to the doctor in the last solo Frankenstein film, and, frustrated at their inability to track down the doctor, go for the original monster instead. How the monster comes into conflict with the Wolfman, there's several possibilities. Maybe swap out the monster's brain via the ghost of Frankenstein, that'd be a fun callback. Maybe they convince the monster the resistance has something he needs, or otherwise manipulate his incredibly emotionally vulnerable monster to see the resistance as an enemy. Talbot should, I think, at this point have advanced to the point where he has some control over his ability and can use it as an asset for the resistance. making himself beloved, but at the same time, his indulging in the curse is gradually turning him faster and faster into a full-on monster. It should be this aspect that solves the initial conflict with the Doctor not wanting to be involved with any mad science, as the two become friends or possibly even lovers. We could even make the Doctor a cis woman and have her and Larry have a child together. When Larry does fight the monster, we don't need a clear winner, and it can end in a draw because there's nothing really at stake to win here. But rather than in the original movie there being a flood or something, Frankenstein should come around to understand Larry, either realizing that they've been duped, or in the case that their brain has been replaced, realizing, that they've been turned into a monster by the Nazis and used as a weapon. Neither of the monsters need to die by the end because the next film will be a direct sequel. Taking place near the end of the war, we find Larry Talbot, who is trying to be useful in fighting the Nazis, but is slowly becoming less and less human every day. He's so afraid of himself by this point that he's intentionally distanced himself from Dr. Frankenstein and his potential child, if that's where we went in the last one, and I kind of think it should be. Worryingly, Talbot will also find themselves going up against not just Nazis, but Frankenstein monsters as well, creations of Nazi scientists who have reverse engineered what they learned from the original monster. We'll eventually discover that Dracula is behind the strings, leading world events to exactly this, and that as bad as things are, we've yet to see the ultimate horror be unleashed. It'll be up to the original Frankenstein monster, Larry, the current Van Helsing, and possibly the current Doctor to confront Dracula and try to stop him. This should all boil down to Larry sacrificing himself to stop Dracula, and of course, the revelation that the true monsters were men, and that stopping Dracula won't stop the inevitable use of the atomic bomb. At the end of the series, we'll have 10 films. We'll start with the first Dracula, and we can call it Legend of Dracula or whatever, and then have Son of Frankenstein, about our version of Victor Seville, and then right back into another Dracula movie. Return of Dracula, I guess. And then our Larry Talbot movie, and then Emotep. This is the way things used to work for cinematic universes, like I was talking about. You start with a single film, which succeeds and provokes both a sequel and another story in the same genre. When you've done both Frankenstein and Dracula, it only makes sense to do the other main two as well. Once that's done, it's back to sequels, with another Dracula, another Frankenstein, and the Werewolf of Paris adaptation that I mentioned. And finally, a remake of sorts of the very first crossover movie in history, and a climax that takes place during the same period the original films were released in, touching on a subject that they didn't bother with at the time, in a way that only people from after that time can tell. All 10 period pieces with emotionally gripping stories about both the best and the worst of humanity as we slowly watch history unfold and tragedy pile upon tragedy. This is the kind of stories I've always associated with these monsters, and if you're going to make a universe of them, this is really the only way to do it that pays respects to the original Universal monsters and their spirit and legacy. Yes, it's a little Hammer, it's a little Castlevania, but these monsters have always had lives outside of Universal and no one owns history. And well, that's what I would propose. But to take the concept a little further, what would happen after this? If the cinematic universe idea is going to have legs, it needs to be sustainable over multiple phases, right? If you were a Hollywood executive, that's what you'd want to hear, certainly. So how about it? What would a phase 2 of these movies look like if we went in this direction? Well, for the Transylvania trio, the answer is pretty simple. More stories filling out the timeline. Do the Dracula origin story, do the 1897 novel adaptation, do a 16th century story, or any other place in time we haven't already been. For Frankenstein, again, do the origin story in the late 18th century, do a story that shows us how we got from one doctor in the 1800s to multiple monsters in Dracula's army in the 1900s, or any other branch of the family tree that we've missed. For werewolves, we can follow Larry Talbot's kid, or we can tell any story we want from any time we want, really. Do Wilfred Glendon, or David Kessler, or hell, do Valdemar Daninsky. And that's another thing. It would poison the well to start doing more modern stories with these monsters out of the gate with the Universal monsters. But once you're past phase 1 and the brand has been re-established, you're free to explore. I'd say go as far in time as 1999 for a big monster mash, but otherwise I'd probably say the 1980s at the latest for solo films. as I mentioned earlier, you could also do King Kong versus Frankenstein. What I would do is have the original King Kong be part of the continuity, and set it just after that film, with the parent of the Dr. Frankenstein that we meet in Frankenstein versus the Wolfman. Denham will come to Frankenstein hoping they can revive King Kong, and then something fit Ginkgo into it somehow. The events of the film would then be able to set up how the Nazis are aware of the Doctor, and how they could have even been responsible for the death of the Frankenstein Doctor from this film, and that why the Frankenstein we meet in Frankenstein vs. the Wolfman wants nothing to do with her family's legacy. The other big thing you need to do is bring in the creature from the Black Lagoon. See, I told you I'd get back to that. So here's the thing. Fishmen are not the creation of Universal Studios. As far as I know, the first fishmen were the Deep Ones. Deep Ones are fish people with their roots in the Devonian who interbreed with humans. That's their whole thing. So, to take just that part of their story while leaving out all the connections to the bigger picture stuff, like Innsmouth, Johannith, Leia, Dagon, and Cthulhu, is just squandering the material. Again, I don't really know if the people behind the creature from the Black Lagoon have ever read Shadow over Innsmouth. I think it's a really weird coincidence if they hadn't, but coincidences do happen, so there's a solid chance it wasn't a conscious decision on their part. But the fact remains that without those larger cosmic horror aspects of the story, all you got is a bunch of fish fucking. So for our version of that, we're going all the way in, and we're going to use the Deep Ones as our fish monsters, full stop. I really don't think it's worth sticking too closely to the originals in this case, because the Gilman movies were totally distinct, tonally, from the movies of the 30s and 40s. This does kind of go against what I was hammering home about nailing the branding of this being the Universal Monsters, but I'm not the marketing person who decided a series of sci-fi films from the 50s should be advertised in the same breath as gothic horror movies from a time before Hiroshima. I don't know who's responsible for that very stupid decision, but I'm not that person. I don't understand that person, and in this scenario, I'm only the one responsible for picking up the pieces of that very dumb decision. We can certainly do a version of the original creature from the Black Lagoon, but it'll be with a very drastic tone and setting shift. It'll take place in Lovecraft country. It doesn't have to be Innsmouth, it doesn't have to be a whole town of fishmen at first, but it's gotta be in the same general area, and it's 100% taking place during Lovecraft's time, the interwar period. No earlier, no later. The girl the Deep Ones go after will absolutely be knocked up by the end of the movie, and our audience needs to know this, but the characters don't. They can, but they don't need to. The child will, of course, grow up to be the protagonist of our inevitable Shadow over Innsmouth adaptation. And finally, of course, we don't really need to show much of it, but we do need to escalate the stakes at the end of the movie. We need to have the characters realize that this isn't an isolated monster, but just one citizen of a whole city of Deep Ones, and that either Dagon or Cthulhu, not both because that overcomplicates the mythology, is out there. We have to show the audience the god of the Deep Ones, have the ingenue's love interest go mad from having seen it or experienced it, and then that's where it ends. And then, of course, we can also use this as a way to reveal that, like I was alluding to earlier, this is the source, ultimately, of Dracula and Imhotep's powers, that it is tied up in some sort of Yog-Sothoth eldritch magic sort of thing. The future of these plot lines could ultimately lead us into a four-way clash of the titans with Dracula in its true form, King Kong, Cthulhu or Dagon, probably Cthulhu, and then Imhotep in some sort of giant monstrous form, all battling it out in the city somewhere. And that would be cool as hell, and I really want to see that. But, you know, at this point, it's kind of like dreaming big, and the further along the road we go, the more experimental we get, and the more distant we are from my original concept of how to start a UMCU in the first place. So I'm going to leave it at that. I hope this was interesting to at least somebody. It was fun to think about, although it's had the unfortunate side effect of making me realize how badly I want someone to actually do something like this. Lord knows Toho doesn't even really make non-Godzilla monster movies anymore, but, you know, hey, like I said, nobody owns these monsters anymore. Anyone can put these stories out there without the evil copyright phantom trying to gobble them up. I could very well just go and write these stories myself, as screenplays if I really wanted. Of course, that wasn't the point I was trying to accomplish here, but I could. And then that just kind of makes me think about how copyright is bullshit and should be abolished. Maybe I'll do a video about that, who knows. And why else? I think I'm going to try and make more things kind of like this. I don't know when. I don't really know what about just now, but it's definitely something I'd like to try. And if that sounds cool to you, feel free to stick around and keep tabs on it if you like. If it doesn't, and you hate this, and you think it was a waste of your time, you know, that's fair, whatever, I'm not your mom. You don't have to listen to me. But either way, until next time, transforming robots, transform yourselves into the shape of cars and drive away. And yes, that is my sign off. That's the thing that I've decided I'm going to do. You're welcome.